Alrighty, everyone. Glad to have you here. Glad to talk about some cybersecurity stuff. Um, if you've stuck with the conference thus far, you are a hero, and you should be commended for all of your masterful effort. I know it's been a long day for everyone, and probably a long week. I know particularly these past couple weeks have been particularly difficult for everyone. So glad that you're here, glad that we're learning together, and I know that the conference is also doing a lot of sponsorship of charities and such. So if you've bought a conference ticket, thank you, really, truly, thank you from everyone in the world, I guess, at this point for your donation and for your help, because these are difficult times. As far as the actual topic that we're going to be talking about today, though, this one's a little bit interesting. And by interesting, I mean different from your typical blue team talk. For example, we're talking about offense, but from a blue team perspective. And to have that conversation, what you really need, is a cool presenter. Dang it. Wow, I failed at that, didn't I? But you can tell I'm cool by the sunglasses. You see, those are standard issue, plus the jacket, absolutely epic. But what really is true is that I'm actually more of a nerd than anything else. So if you look at this here, this is actually my my car. Well, it was my car before the fire. There was a fire. But more importantly, and more direct to the nerd bit, is if you look at that centerpiece, there's actually an Ethernet port that's sticking out of that, because I can't buy a thing without hacking a thing. That's literally all that I ever do. So while the cool shades and the super duper epic, you know what I mean, leather jacket might lead you astray to think that I'm actually cool, it's a game. I'm completely faking it. And what I like to say about cybersecurity is that it's all about faking it until you make it. By which point is, when we're talking about the offense or when we're talking about the defense, the truth, the reality of our circumstances, of our virtual machine, of our environment, of our vulnerabilities, that truth is what we sell. And what we sell is entirely our choice. But when it comes down to it, at the very end of the day, if you want to describe me by anything, it's red. But we're in the blue team track. Huh, how did that happen? To be completely honest, there's nothing I like more than doing a red team and losing. Like, if the blue team comes at me and I get owned, like they wipe the floor with me, that's the best time ever. Like, that is absolutely outstanding. And the reason for that is, when I'm losing, I'm learning. If I'm just going in and calling in the office, 9 to 5 and doing the same thing every day, sure, I guess I get more experience at doing the things that I know, but we don't really grow. And growth is really important in cybersecurity because things are changing constantly. In fact, I was on the phone this past week with a bunch of organizations, and next week I'm going to be on the phone with Bank of America talking about COVID-19 related phishing ruses, because intrusion sets, specifically like tons and tons of intrusion sets, are switching all of their TTP over to leveraging a lot of our fear, uncertainty, and doubt in order to gain access to networks. And right now, I mean, we're at home, but so are the attackers, which means they've got a lot more time to do this attacking stuff. And so when I think about defense, I'm really focused on defense from the perspective of the offense. And so my background's on this as well. I used to be in the US military. We built cyber tactics, techniques, and procedures. So TTP, which is one of those big buzzwords, if you will. At the time, we were actually working with MITRE, and MITRE's got an office here down the street in San Antonio, on what became the MITRE attack framework. But the thing is, while these might be focused on attacks, what's important to realize is that the entire purpose behind these things is defense. And I think as red teamers, it's really easy for us to lose sight of that reality. And for some red teamers, a lot of their background might actually be in intelligence services, like say TAO at the NSA. And so their reality is different. Their attack is for the purpose of attack, allegedly. But for those of us in the private sector, even those of us doing red team or purple team or penetration testing, vulnerability assessment, at the end of the day, our objective is to prevent organizations from being compromised, or at the very least, to mitigate what our loss looks like when we're compromised. And an example of that might be something like this. When we talk about defenders, defenders have this fatalistic point of view, right? If I lose once, right, there's somebody who sends a phishing email in and a user clicks on it because they're scared because COVID-19 is going on and now there's malware in my environment. If I lose once, I lose. The attacker only needs one of these victims to have access to the environment. But this fatalistic point of view is kind of inaccurate too, right? Like, let's take a look at that MITRE attack framework. You go from initial access, but you don't go from initial access to actions on objectives. We say Lockheed Martin's cyber kill chain, which they ripped off from the military because we always had a kill chain. Whatever, TM, my bad, TM. So if we talk about something like this, right? Well, what's the inevitable result the attacker's looking for? They don't go from email click to dropping something like ransomware on the environment and monetizing, because their objective at the end of the day is just like any of ours. It's to feed their family or to buy that Lamborghini. I mean, well, I guess it's on the slide. You saw my car, okay? Lamborghini, who needs a Lamborghini when you've got a walking fireball? And yes, it really did catch fire. Note to self, don't build a car from scratch and pay your mechanic. They are worth every cent and every dime that you give them, because alternatively, your car might be a fireball. Huh. But at the end of the day, whether you're out there to earn that Lamborghini or you're out there to defend or penetrate networks, when we're doing these things legally, the objective is going to be security. And if we're talking about security and we're talking about cybersecurity, right? Smoke, mirrors, a story. The story that we tell an attacker is going to be the genesis of their journey as they seek to penetrate our network. And if that journey is really difficult, if that journey has a lot of switchbacks, if that journey is deceptive in nature, we've got a distinct advantage when it comes to our fight for cybersecurity. See, the thing is, this fatalistic point of view about losing being inevitable is correct. Absolutely, we're going to have our users click on those links. Layer 8 is our first point of vulnerability, and it is inevitable. I was teaching actually a class in Japan fairly recently, before the epidemic. So right before the epidemic, in fact, I was in Japan, I guess not before. And while I was teaching, I actually had to rush back to the United States because we were closing all of our borders. Turns out, I guess that was a good decision. And so, but when I'm teaching a different place, I like to learn a little bit of the language. And in Japan, they've got this term they call, or this phrase they say, and it's shogunai. And shogunai means it's inevitable. It doesn't mean, it's kind of a curse word, but at the end of the day, it means things happen. I guess our equivalent is, Forrest Gump, shit happens. But what it means to us in cybersecurity is, well, last couple of weeks I've been doing some presentations and I had a demo fail. Shogunai, it happens. Attackers penetrate our networks. Shogunai, it happens. But that doesn't mean we've lost. It doesn't mean we've lost the initiative even. It gives us the opportunity to regain that initiative and to, well, own them back. The thing is, defenders don't need to be successful 100% of the time. They need to be successful at some point throughout the entire kill chain, the entire compromise that an attacker is attempting to perform. For example, last year I was doing an incident response. So I work for Open Security. By work for, I guess I made the company, so I work for them. And so we were doing an incident response. And it's really not comical. This organization, they were hacked really, really badly. They weren't a big company. They're mid-sized. They make a decent amount of money, but they have, say, 200, 300 employees. And so they were hacked completely, like terribly, and they were ransomed for $1.4 million. And that ransom of $1.4 million was negotiated down. The attackers asked for more, a lot more. I think it was like 2.8 or 3.2 or something like that. I forget the numbers. There have been too many There have been too many ransomware incidents in my previous history, my recent history, and so I'm a little bit traumatized. I'm very, very sorry. But it was millions and millions of dollars. And so they actually reached out to their insurance provider. Their insurance provider covered some of it. But what's interesting is the insurance provider reached out to another firm. And that firm's entire objective, all that they do, they're a company out of New York. The only thing that this company does is communicate with ransomware attackers to negotiate down the extortion. They don't prevent you from getting hacked. Their objective isn't security. Their objective is that once you get hacked, you pay less. I mean, this is the world we live in today. That's insane, right? But the thing is, if that is when things go, well, terribly wrong, do we need to prevent the phishing email, or do we need to prevent what happens next? And I think our biggest mistake on the blue team side is that we're so focused on losing that we don't have insight on the bigger picture. Because when we have a little loss, if you will, like Petite Mourir, right? Wishes French for a little death. When we have a little bit of death, that doesn't mean that we've lost. It doesn't mean that we're paying these extortionate ransomware fees. It does mean that we have to start incident handling. But incident handling itself is actually an opportunity on the defense, and we'll talk about here in just a little bit. The thing is, we don't need to cut off our nose to spite our face. Maybe that's how the saying goes. I forget. But the point is that losing is inevitable, and the quickest way to have a massive defeat is to cede the initiative to the attacker. If we say, hey, when somebody gets a phishing email that's successful, we lose, it's over. Well, yeah, if we want to make that statement, if we want to live in that situation, that circumstance, then yeah, losing is inevitable, and once that phishing email happens, yeah, absolutely. If our users are all domain administrators, or heck, all of our users are local administrators, right? An attacker does a client-side attack with a phishing email, they get access to a system, then they have to do privilege escalation in order to get administrative access to that device. Once they have administrative access, they might do something like Mimikatz in order to pull memory from the local security account subsystem service LSASS's memory, which will then allow them potentially, let's say there's no credential guard, to gain access to plain text credentials in memory. In those situations, if we've allowed all of that to happen by default on every phishing email, we're going to be in for a world of hurt. But this is why we have an onion model of security, because things don't end at the beginning. I mean, hopefully there's a tale to tell. And so if it comes down to it, when we think about ourselves and our cybersecurity programs, we actually do have an opportunity here, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. For example, if we look at something like the Maginot Line, more words about that need be said, nor French security in general, I suppose. The thing is, if all of our defenses are at the boundary, once you say go through Belgium and get around that, yeah, we're in for some serious problems. But more importantly, there's some parallels here we have to military science and cybersecurity that we can take advantage of in order to not have to relearn these things. And so one of my personal passions, passion I gained, I guess, when I was in the military, is what we call miso. And I don't mean the soup, though it is really good. It's military influence operations. It's about military deception. MILDEC is another word that we use for it. IO, influence operations. But the point is, the story we sell is the way that attackers, or defenders for that matter, will actually implement their strategy. If we have a bunch of blow-up tanks in England and they're believable, they mean things. World War II versus current day parallels. Something like, say, Sun Tzu. So if we think about this and we're fighting the right fight, unlike, say, unfortunate kittens, we won't get punched in the face. Our defensive strategy should not be counterproductive to itself. And if we think about the attack strategy, we can base our defenses around that in a way that will allow us to grow and be more powerful, which engenders a discussion about something called poison versus venom. This is actually something that Black Hills is really big on as well. Black Hills is one of the sponsors of this event. When we think about poison, poison is something that you can ingest, and then, well, unfortunately, you might die. With venom, it's something that's injected, right? Passive versus active styles of defense. And so when we think about something like, say, cyberspace trapping, which is what this talk is entirely about, what we have to realize is that if we have the opportunity to deliver poison, we have the opportunity to orchestrate our environment in such a way that it's resilient and it's able to defend itself. And perhaps defend is not the right word here. But let's take some examples here. And we're going to run through some of these cyberspace traps, some examples of them, and see some of them in action, in fact. In fact, as a red teamer, I've got I guess this is a humble brag. So I was giving this talk. This talk has evolved significantly and is very different at this point, but I gave something like this talk about cyberspace trapping in 2013. We were developing this concept actually for the US government. And 3 years later, I was actually working for Black Hills at the time, and I was doing a penetration test, or not penetration, a red team. And I got caught really fast. And I'm like, why, what happened? I didn't think that I tripped any sensors. And the thing was, somebody had listened to that talk in 2013, and they put together a cyberspace trap based on the things I said an attacker's going to do. And they got me with my own trap, which was fantastic, absolutely amazing to see something like that work in practice. These things work, and our defenses, they don't need to be brick walls that somebody can go around. They can be based on what the attackers themselves actually do. And if we orchestrate our defenses around the attack, we've got a lot more opportunities and a lot more cost-effective opportunities as well. Because if we think about TTP, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that adversaries leverage to penetrate our environments and achieve their actions on objectives, well, those tactics are goal-focused. If we look at our traditional defenses, like let's say Mimikatz, right, pulling memory from LSASS memory, pulling data from LSASS memory in order to look for plain text credentials. Well, does that work? Yes. In fact, according to the NSA Red Team, that is the #1 threat to US government environments, though that fact is a little bit dated at this point because I haven't worked with them in a while. But I still feel like it's absolutely true. It's a big, big deal. But our defenses for something like this, they tend to be based around signatures. Let's say we've got semantic antivirus. Okay. Well, semantic's got a signature for mimikatz.exe. What about mimikatz.ps1? This is a fact, and this is hilarious. I demonstrate this every time I teach a SANS class, actually, basically every time I teach a SANS class. It's about PowerView, PowerSploit, in fact, that whole framework. Written by a bunch of people in the community who've done some absolutely amazing stuff. But if you want to import PowerView, Microsoft Windows Defender will signature on that and say that that's malware, right? In PowerShell via AMSI, which is really, really cool. But it'll signature. If you Control F to find and replace the Twitter handles of Matt Graber, Manifestation, and Will Schroeder, Harmjoy, just find and replace those with blank. It will work. It'll import just fine. And now that I'm saying that, maybe Microsoft might do something about that. But the point is, that works, and it's worked for me for like 6 months now. It's insane. What kind of signature is this? What? Really? The Twitter handle? Like, and in fact, I've seen this for myself too. My Twitter handle has been signatures in Microsoft Windows Defender, and that is absolutely fantastic to me. I'm so excited by that. It makes me feel like it's almost like having a Wikipedia entry about you, right? Except in a cybersecurity context. So cool. But if we're defenders, is this our defense, really? Twitter handle signatures. Oh, geez. This is what we call building signatures based on the technique or the procedure. The tactic is pulling, let's say it's Mimikatz, right? Tactic is pulling memory from LSASS in order to look for plain text credentials. You can do that in a zillion different ways. There's plenty of ways you can do this. That's the tactic. A signature based on a technique is destined to fail. And let's say that we have a behavioral signature, like let's say you're using Cylance, right? Cylance triggers on, say, reflective DLL injection the way that Metasploit does it. In fact, Joff Thayer, penetration tester with Black Hills, he built a bypass for this based on memory mapping shellcode. It's still Metasploit's interpreter. There is no difference. The difference is the way that it instantiates itself into memory, because the signature in Cylance, while a really cool signature to be frank, isn't actually based on what's malicious. It's a signature for a pattern of behavior. It's not a behavioral detection. It's a pattern of behavior that's then got a signature against it. And so if we then instead build our defenses around a tactic, we've got bigger opportunities here. Let's take a look at that with cyberspace trapping. The thing is, we can't build a trap until we understand the attack. So trapping 101 is we can't win, we can't know or win until we know ourselves. So we know what the attacker is going to go after, and we know our enemy, so we know what they're going to do. Something like Mimikatz. For example, if we look at something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, one of the things I like to say all the time is that no intrusion set uses all of these tactics, but every intrusion set uses some of these tactics. And so if we've got some defenses based on our knowledge of the attackers, we can build ourselves a really secure and powerful environment. Here's that MITRE ATT&CK framework, in fact. So if we have, say, techniques that are a subset of all of these tactics, say initial access, credential access, all of this stuff, we can design traps around them. We're going to focus on Mimikatz first, but then we're going to branch out into a couple different tactics that I think are pretty interesting. But Mimikatz is just so ubiquitous. I mean, there are very, very few intrusion sets who don't use a tactic like this, simply because it's so very powerful. In very modern Windows operating systems, like say Server 2012 or Server 2016 and Windows 10, Credential Guard does in fact do say Hyper-V based virtualization in order to protect the memory space of LSASS. In Server 2012, that's what I was misspeaking about, which is a Windows 8.0 kernel, not 8.1. Credential Guard is not there. LSASS is still vulnerable, it's still open. And what people don't quite understand is some of the interesting intrinsic things about this. Say, for example, as of January of last year, the most common, the most ubiquitous operating system in the world is actually Windows 10. Windows 10 is the most common operating system in the world today, which is pretty darn cool, because it means that most operating systems today, well, the most common operating system today has Credential Guard. That's awesome. But if attackers are using Mimikatz in order to escalate privileges, and they need to have local admin in order to use Mimikatz to get access to that memory space, it means that this privilege escalation is focused on domain-based privilege escalation. Things like getting domain users who have permissions on other systems, or getting domain administrator. Okay? Where or what systems are those that are most likely to have domain admins logged in? Workstations or servers? The most common server operating system in use today is Windows Server 2008 R2. It's 2020. I mean, we're 12 years past 2008 at this point. When I'm doing red team myself, I very rarely actually focus on workstations. In fact, I generally ignore them today. That wasn't, I would say, the truth, say, 5-6 years ago, but these days I essentially consider workstation to be relevant because I want to escalate at that point to domain admin, which means I want the servers where domain admins are logging in and they are administering. And these servers are by and large Windows Server 2008 R2. Unless you're using Server 2016 or Server 2019, you do not have Credential Guard. This is a big deal. That's a really good defense. Because the thing is, we can pull LSASS memory in a large number of ways. For example, this is Mimikatz. If you have AV of any sort, this .exe should have a signature. It's really bad. When I was making this actual GIF here, I didn't actually realize that my Windows 10 system would also expose credentials, but if you look really, really closely, you'll see one of my passwords. Oops. How else can we steal LSASS memory? Windows Task Manager. Is Task Manager a virus? Is it malware? Does it signature under anything? No, but you can right-click on a process and click dump. This is why technique-based defense doesn't work. The tactic of pulling that LSASS memory is something that we actually need to build our defenses against. And we have so many of these Mimikatz implementations these days because it's really dangerous, and every attacker worth a grain of salt is going to want to do something like this because it's so very powerful. PowerShell, C#, built into individual malware toolkits like Cobalt Strike or PowerShell Empire. There's lots and lots of different Mimikatz. the exe, pulling back the memory dump, and then evaluating it with Mimikatz locally, yet another technique in order to perform this tactic. And so if you think about cyberspace trapping instead of traditional defense, we actually have some pretty interesting opportunities here. For example, the tactic here used by an attacker is to elevate their privileges by gaining access to LSASS memory and looking at plain text credentials that are there. The technique could be anything: PowerShell, Windows Task Manager, you name it. Traditional defense has two styles here, and I do want to absolutely say that traditional defense is valuable and we should do it as well. But the two styles are: one, get a signature and pray that it works, and that our attackers are using the exact same technique over and over again, because that's the only way that our signature is going to work. This is not a very good style of defense. There is another style of traditional defense that's really interesting, though, and I do think is worth merit and mention. I do a lot of CTFs, or I did a lot of CTFs once upon a time. These days, I do a decent amount of support for CTFs. So let's say we're talking about like CDX or CCDC. These are CTFs where you've got students who are the defenders and they're competing. CCDC, for example, is intercollegiate, and so they've got local, regional qualifiers and national competitions and such. Call it the Rose Bowl of cybersecurity, if you will. But of course, they need to have attackers who then attack these environments the students are trying to defend in order for the students to have something to defend against. So these days, I do a decent amount of, say, some of that kind of stuff. And I was helping out the NSA Red Team with an exercise called CDX. That exercise has been changed, I think, fairly recently. I was apprised of that last year, and I've not been paying attention since. But the point is, the NSA Red Team supports exercise that is the students and cadets at the West Point and Air Force Academy and such. And when I was at the Air Force Academy myself, I participated as a student. And now occasionally, it's been a while now, but I did do Red Team stuff to help the students learn, if you will. And by learn, I mean I bashed them on the face with a stick over and over again until they learned cybersecurity concepts. Really fun, right? And so I was helping out with the CDX at one point, actually alongside some really, really cool people. Will Schroeder's, that's the guy who made Harmjoy. That is Harmjoy, that's the guy who made PowerView. Rafi Mudge was there, as the creator of Cobalt Strike. So if you contribute to these CTFs, and I really recommend you do, you'll get to hang out with some really, really cool people, which is awesome. But so we were doing this CDX for the Royal Military Academy out of Canada, and then all the US military academies as well. And so we were stomping on them. Like, we were just absolutely stomping on them. And the academy that won was actually Annapolis. That's the Naval Academy. And it wasn't because their cybersecurity practitioners, their students were better. They really weren't better. But there was one thing they did differently. One thing. They never logged into a system with domain administrator credentials. They used local administrator instead. Traditional defense includes information awareness training. And we think about this for layer 8. We think about this for users who are going to click links, but that's not correct. What about our administrators who administer systems? Should they be using domain admin? Or could they use something like the local administrator password solution? Could they use something like CyberArk? Could they use something like sticky notes with passwords on them for local admin user accounts on individual systems to log into those systems? Yeah, absolutely. They could do anything of the sort. And well, when we think about domain admin, well, if you want to administer the domain, you need to be the domain admin, right? That's not true. You need to be admin on systems in the domain, and domain admin is an admin on all of the systems. That means that if an attacker gets it via Mimikatz, let's say, so are they. If you don't use domain admin, if you use local admin instead, or at least as much as you possibly can, Mimikatz is ineffective. That's a really powerful defensive strategy, and it's traditional in nature. It's not something we do, but it's very, very traditional, and we should do that, absolutely. I think information awareness training for our administrators, our system owners, our IT admins, our help desk is one of the most vital things that we can do in cybersecurity, and it's not something we think about, because we think, hey, there's no CVSS score for domain admin use. That's correct, there isn't. But we didn't own the Air Force Academy, AFIT, West Point, Royal Canadian Military Academy because they had no vulnerabilities or because they had vulnerabilities. The reason that Annapolis won in this situation is because that they had better practices from a defensive perspective. Nothing to do with vulnerabilities at all. And I think there's this big overemphasis on vulnerabilities. Attackers don't use 0 days. Almost ever. I mean, do they? Sure, I guess. But if we look at WannaCry was never based on a 0 day, or NotPetya, or whatever you want to call it, right? Those worms were based on an exploit that sure was 0 day at some point when insert agency name here leveraged it. But when it really became something that organizations, the average enterprise, was worried about, it wasn't a 0 day at all. The way that we administer these systems is important because from a post-exploitation perspective, it makes a big difference. So I don't want to by any means say that traditional defense is bad. Signature-based defense is certainly very shallow, but there's a lot involved in traditional defense, and we need to consider those aspects as well. But cyberspace trapping is a very different way to look at cybersecurity. Because the idea here is, what if, and walk with me here, what if, let's say, we can magically put a fake user account, or maybe a real user account, but a fake password into LSASS. So an attacker gets in a system, he's like, oh yeah, there's a local admin on this box, or I pre-escalated, I'm in, like Flynn, I'm going to use my Mimikatz. They run Mimikatz, right? And they get a user account and a password for that user account in plain text. That's how Mimikatz works. And so then they look at the domain real quick and say, oh my gosh, that user account, admin X, let's say, he's a domain admin, and I got his password in plain text. Is an attacker going to use that password? I mean, they wouldn't have used Mimikatz if they didn't intend to use what they got from Mimikatz, right? So yeah, I get that password, I'm going to use that password. What happens if that password doesn't work? Let's say you try it and it says login authentication failed. Well, that's actually pretty typical for a red teamer like me, right? We might get an account credential that's in memory on a system because that system hasn't rebooted in a while. But then we try to use that credential, that password may have already changed. That's not atypical. So as an attacker, I look at that and say, ah, crap, I thought I had it. But not quite, not this time. Okay, well, what next? Keep going. What if we do something special on the defensive side? Let's say that we've got this credential magically into memory. Okay. But we configure a very specialized, fine-grained password policy in Windows Active Directory where the user has a specialized password policy. And that password policy says any incorrect attempt to log in locks out the account. Generally in Active Directory, we have a 3 lockout policy. So in Active Directory, the default for Windows login attempts for domain users go like this. You guess your password, get it wrong, okay, no worries, try it again. Get it wrong, no worries, try it again. Try it a 3rd time, get it wrong, and your account is locked out. There's a lockout policy. Because users finger the passwords all the time. This is pretty common, so we need to actually have a lockout policy that doesn't lock out immediately. But what if we have a user that's not a real user? It's fake, it's a trap. And the only way to even find out about this user is to look in memory in LSASS because we've magically wizarded our credential account into the LSASS. Okay? If somebody tries to log into this account, it means they stole memory from a system level process somewhere in our environment. Is that okay? No, absolutely not. The thing is, if we build a signature or a detection based on this, it's actually pretty difficult because if we build a detection on the technique, well, there's a lot of different techniques to access memory. Heck, the process itself needs to access memory because that's what memory is there for. So we can't really build a detection on the technique here. But the tactic isn't get memory. The tactic is escalate privileges with what you got from memory. So we've got a lockout policy that locks out after 1 unsuccessful attempt. The only chance to get that and perform that unsuccessful attempt is to do one of the #1 tactics that adversaries use in environments. If that account's locked out, what does it mean? It means they're compromised. What else does it mean? It means the attacker's got local administrator on that system as well. What else does it mean? It means we know what system they're on. Because if we've got a trap, say dashboard, with this really, really, really effective tool. It's super advanced, by the way, called Microsoft Excel. And it's a spreadsheet that says IP address and user account. And so we see the account's locked out. What we know the IP address where that trap was set. We now know that we're compromised, and we know exactly what system that attacker is on. Let's begin incident handling, and if we can kick them out of the environment before they successfully fully compromise our environment, which might take them months and months. I mean, most organizations that are compromised for anywhere between 8 months and 3 years before they actually know that they're compromised. If we can begin that process immediately, it doesn't matter that we're compromised. We still prevented their actions on objectives. And we can absolutely do this. Now, how do we sneak these credentials into LSASS? There's 2 ways. The first and most obvious one is actually created by, Mark Baggett. And so Mark Baggett said, hey, if you run as /net only, and you type in a wrong password, does that password get into LSASS? And the answer is yes. If you run as on Windows, the default command, and you just type in a gibberish user account and a gibberish password, that user account and credential is in memory. And if you run Mimikatz, you'll get that. That's all there is to it. And of course, the next thing is, how do we want to scale this to enterprise level? Because just because it's in memory doesn't mean that we can put these traps all over the place. There's actually a toolkit called PowerShell Suite by Fuzzy Security that'll let you do this. This will let you use PowerShell in order to put it in memory, and we can use something like WinRMs, Windows Remote Management, in order to put it in memory in all kinds of systems, or we could even set up some kind of script that runs on boot or login of the system in order to make this trap viable and ubiquitous in our environment. But the real thing to take away from this isn't that, oh, we should trap Mimikatz and LSASS. Yes, you should trap Mimikatz and LSASS. This is the trap that I was talking about earlier that got me caught as a red teamer, because I've never seen this defense on an environment ever. So if I get Mimikatz to work, what do I think? Yeah, I got myself some domain admin creds, and I'm going to use those. I don't even second guess it until somebody saw my talk and did that on an environment that I was pen testing and absolutely owned me, because it works. As a red teamer, we do our tactics and techniques for a reason. And once we receive those results back, we leverage those moving forward into the actual compromise. This is why defense shouldn't be at the border or the boundary, because there's so much that an attacker must do afterwards. And all of that is opportunity space for us to detect them and respond. How do we monitor for these things? Well, you could use something here like, say, PowerShell in order to just check for accounts that are locked out. Very, very quick and easy to do. Now, what else we could do is we could actually run a routine with PowerShell that puts this into, say, the Windows event logs, and we could open that in something like Helpstack. We could actually make ourselves a trap dashboard based on all these traps, because that's really what's important to acknowledge here. There's a lot of different opportunities for traps. If we go all the way back to that MITRE ATT&CK framework, we saw that there were a lot of tactics, and underneath those tactics are techniques. And within those techniques are different sets of procedures that an attacker will run through. And every single thing that an attacker does on our environment is an opportunity for us to poison the root of the tree itself. And that's all an opportunity for us to defend the environment better. What other kind of implementations might we do just based on passwords? What about a password.txt file, right? Like, we are always complaining about our dumb users. Oh man, can you believe that Jim over there, that guy put a he even named it password.txt, and he put it on his desktop, and he put all of his company passwords in there. And we got compromised last year because of it. Can you believe that guy? At least they fired him. Gosh. The thing is, there's going to be another Jim. And if our defenses are based on our suppositions of users doing what's right and secure, we're going to lose. We are going to lose, and attackers are going to take advantage of us, and they're going to laugh at us. But the thing is, what if we have a fake password.txt file? Heck, it might even be a fake user. Same exact trap, same user lockout, all of that, right? We know that our users do bad things. Users are dumb, let's say. And we know that attackers know this. And we know that attackers look for this. What if we provide that? and look for the usage of this fake information, of this poison that we provided them. I live in San Antonio, Texas, and it's really hot outside, which is why I'm wearing a t-shirt. It's, I think it was like 95 today or something crazy like that, and it's only gonna get hotter over the summer. We also have a lot of fire ants. Go figure. So we bought last week actually, and just like scattered around the house is a little like fire ant food poison stuff. And so the ants, they go in and they take it and they bring it back to the den, the hive, and they kill all the other ants because all the other ants eat it, and the queen and such. But this is what we're talking about from a cybersecurity perspective, right? We know that ants are coming to my house and looking for food, so we give them that food. Except the food provides us benefit and not them. And we can absolutely do this in cybersecurity. These are our networks. We should know them better than the attackers. And we have the opportunity to orchestrate them in such a way that they give us favors as opposed to them. What other kind of traps can we do that are not password related, or even that are password related? What about fake authentication portals? When I'm doing a pen test, do I see Telnet all the time? Yes, I do. It's unfortunate, but I do. So what do I do with that? Well, Telnet's there. The password's probably Cisco. Username and password, that is. Well, what if we provide that to an attacker? No real administrator is going to try to administer a system that isn't a system. So if somebody does, what does that mean? It means we really should know about it, because it means that if we do, we've got an opportunity to do something about it. So the thing is with cybersecurity, and this is a Sun Tzu quote, if we pretend inferiority and encourage the arrogance of our attackers, right? I'm so arrogant that if I run Mimikatz and I get domain admin credentials, I believe that those will work for me. Encourage that tendency in your attackers and take advantage of it, because we can win that way. We can win really hard that way. What our entire objective here is to get into that decision-making cycle of the attacker itself, right? The attacker gets into a system, and now that they've got access, because they got a phishing email, they got clicked on, they have to observe their new position. They have to orient themselves to the new circumstances. Oh, I got a system. Or maybe I have a backdoor now. Maybe that backdoor is admin. Maybe it's not admin. I have to identify that situation, and then I have to decide what to do next, and then I have to act upon that decision. If we can observe these attacks, because we've identified them as traps, orient ourselves to the attacker's circumstance in our environment, the compromise, decide what to do about it, and kick them out before they can, it doesn't matter that we've been compromised. Because let's say we get compromised and hacked 5 times a day, every day, but every single time we're able to boot them out before they deliver actions on objectives, before the ransomware hits. Does it matter that we got an incident? The thing is, as defenders, we look at a compromise like, oh man, we had like 5 incidents last week. This is a big deal. And sure, to some extent, it's a big deal. But if we had 5 incidents, but nothing significant, that's a big deal too. That's a win. We need to identify our wins, and we need to emphasize the procedures that we do that allow us to actualize those wins. If our decision-making cycle is going ahead the attacker's decision-making cycle, we win. In fact, the OODA Loop is based off of dogfighting methodology from John Boyd. More military parallels here. It's the same thing for us in our fight to secure and defend our environments. What about other traps? Check this one out. And yeah, there's some Black Hills logos there. DLP, data loss prevention, right? Or protection. There's a lot of solutions out there, like say Fidelis, that are all about protection or identifying when things exfiltrate your environment, when your secure, sensitive information gets stolen. They all kind of suck, right? Because they don't have the ability to penetrate and encrypt the channel. I mean, maybe they do HTTPS intersection, but like if within that HTTPS SSL/TLS channel, the information is also AES encrypted, which any good backdoor will do. I mean, even for OPSEC, our open source backdoors do that. Does this system work? No. DLP is effective in one situation. That's when you have a user who's dumb and trying to steal company information via email. That's when DLP works. And that's basically it. I'm sorry if you're watching and you work at Fidelis. I've worked for companies that have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on your product, and I have never recommended it. My bad. But how can we actually identify this? Attackers want to steal information. I mean, the Chinese F-22, oops, I guess it's not the F-22 and it's Chinese. The Chinese F-22 looks a lot like the American F-22, doesn't it? Theft of intellectual property happens all the time, and it's one of the things that attackers really do all the time too, and it's really hard for us to identify because they didn't send us a note on our desktop that says pay me Bitcoin. There's a lot more intellectual property theft that goes on via cybersecurity means than we realize, because it's just not as blatant as something like ransomware. How do we know when a document gets exfiltrated? Because we're monitoring our gateway? Because we're monitoring the document. So with Microsoft Word documents, you actually have the ability to implement or to insert an image. I'm sure most of us have kind of like dragged and dropped an image into a Microsoft Word document. Happens all the time. But consider this. In Microsoft Word, you can insert not just an image, but a link to an image. That means when the document opens, the document reaches out to the local file system, to the internet, in order to get that image. So if we have an image that links to, let's say, nothing, literally nothing, it's not even a real image, but it does go to a website trying to pull down that image. Whenever that document is opened, that web server has a log, an access log that says, hey, somebody tried to open this image. Okay, if that happens from the IP address of the company, is that normal? Yes. Heck, if that happens from the neighborhood where the people work at for the company, is that normal? Yeah, probably. If that IP address is from North Korea, is that normal? We're building a trap based on the attacker's objective. In this case, information theft. And the thing is, this document doesn't have to be a real one. It can be a fake one. Maybe the attacker thinks they got lucky. Somebody's being really laissez-faire with their information, and they're putting it all over the place, all over the internal network. Well, we found them before they found the real information that we're trying to safeguard. This is poison. It's not venom. We're not injecting it into the attacker, right? It's not active defense from the perspective of hacking back. It's just poison. It's our environment. We own it, and we're weaponizing it in order to target specifically the tactics leveraged by attackers against us. And there's all kinds of other traps that you can perform here. Sky's the limit. And the fact that the sky's the limit is also what makes it so powerful. The attacker will never know how you weaponized your environment against them because it is custom security. With a signature, I mean, first thing I will do if I see, hey, there's CrowdStrike in this environment, is I will download and install CrowdStrike and try all of my TTP against it. Once I know exactly what TTP gets flagged and what doesn't, well, I know exactly what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to do as a red teamer. If it's custom security, it's impossible for me to know this. From a government and military perspective, we classify these things because it's important, and that information itself has value. From a private sector perspective, we should think in these terms as well, because it's really important. We can use dashboards to monitor for this stuff too. Elk is a perfect example. If we have account lockouts and we're tracking for the lockout event ID in Elk and the username that we know to be associated with one of our traps, well, boom, you see it right there. Now, it's important to see and identify about a trap dashboard in something like Elk or Splunk versus, say, an active monitoring dashboard. Is here we see an active monitoring dashboard. There's stuff happening. And we might be looking for peaks or things that are outside of the norm in order to identify those indicators of compromise. Let's say that there is a lot more service creation from a certain user than is normal. Well, we want to investigate that. That's traditional defense. In trapping, there's not a lot of false positive. In fact, if it's a really well-designed trap, there's no false positive. I mean, somebody has to steal LSASS memory in order to even find out about a user account, then try to use that No. If your users are doing this, you need to have a very management conversation with that user. That's not normal or acceptable in the organization and company environment. Even if you're a cybersecurity firm, not okay. So with traps, our dashboards are going to look empty until there's a blip. And that blip is the start of that thread begin to unravel. The difference between traps and honeypots is also important to identify. With honeypots, we're creating something that is blank, right? Let's say we have a new system. We just create another system. Let's say it's default corporate image, and we plop it on the network. Okay, honeypot. Anything that happens to that system is by definition malicious because there's no point in that system at all. There's a difference between that and a trap, though. With a honeypot, it's a tabula rasa, right? Blank slate. With a trap, We are identifying the TTP an attacker may use against us. Now, this might be TTP that's typical from, say, the MITRE attack framework, or it might be TTP based specifically on our information, our network, our data, our everything. The more tailored it is, the better trap it is. Traps are active in nature, whereas honeypots are waiting for something to happen. That doesn't make a honeypot bad, but it does make them fundamentally different. And so we can't just create a system that's blank slate and monitor that system. I mean, we can, that's a honeypot, but it's not a cyberspace trap. And that's the general definition between those two. I see a lot of confusion on those kind of things because people think, oh, what's the difference between a honeypot? But that confusion itself also engenders the opportunity to not leverage the opportunity itself of traps as much as you could. The last thing I want to talk about here with this discussion is intelligence gain and loss. And IGL is really important. In fact, it's massively important from the government perspective. They go all about this. In fact, and I can use this example because Wikipedia, thank you, Wikipedia. You should support Wikipedia. There was a compromised circumstance called Agent BTZ, and it was the U.S. I don't know if it's Air Force actually. It was the U.S. military's classified top secret network, and the top secret network was compromised by an, according to Wikipedia, allegedly Russian intrusion set. And this Russian intrusion set had compromised it, and they were using dead drops in order to share the information or steal the information from it. And the NSA knew, and they watched, and they were okay with that. This causes a lot of bruised egos, but the question is, was that okay? And asking that question as opposed to taking some hardline stance without thinking it through is important. For example, let's say that we've created a trap, and that trap is based on robots.txt. Robots.txt has a disallowed entry that says that Google and Baidu and Bing, they shouldn't go and reference this page. Okay, what that reference means is don't go there. So somebody goes there, they're literally looking at robots.txt and doing what it tells them not to do. Okay, so if we create a fake page, it doesn't have to be a real page, it's a fake disallowed entry, and we monitor for somebody going there, what does that mean? It means somebody's doing what told them not to do. It's a trap. It's perhaps not the best trap, but it is a trap. And what do we get from that? As opposed to, let's say, a password-based trap where we know the user account, we know the system, we know all of that jazz. With something like robots.txt, we know the IP address that the bad doer came from. Should we block that IP address? We know it's bad. Should we block it? Think about it, because the question is what matters here. If we block the IP address, what do we get? Well, the attacker needs to have a new IP address in order to keep going after us. That's good. If I'm using DigitalOcean to spawn up IP addresses, how much time does that take me? Okay, so we sold our intelligence, our threat intelligence, on a known bad IP address that very specifically is targeting us for the 5 minutes that it takes for them to use a new IP address from DigitalOcean, let's say. That's 5 minutes of value for this IP address, intel. Okay, what if we just monitor that IP address instead? And 2 weeks later, we see that something in our environment is beaconing out to that IP address. Oh, what do we now know? Well, we already knew the IP address is bad, and now it's in our environment. It's in us, right? Now should we block that IP address? Maybe. Ask the question, should we kick the system out? And then the attacker, I guess, booted out of the environment, and they have to come back in, and then 2 weeks later, we still have that threat intel on an IP address? Maybe. Or should we just block the IP address in order to stop the bleeding immediately? I'm not saying what yes and no the answer is. Your organization's risk tolerance is going to drive that decision making. But if we're not doing the decision making at all, we are selling, we're dumpstering one of the most valuable resources we could possibly have, and that is really, really high value threat intelligence. And so the NSA makes this kind of intelligence gain loss decision all the time. They're willing to sell top secret information for the value of some of this intelligence because they value the intelligence itself over that sometimes. Is that right? Is that wrong? It's not for me to say, right? The organization's got to make that kind of calculus. But if we're not even calculating that, this is information that our traps have the opportunity to provide us, and it's some of the most valuable stuff that we can possibly have from a defensive perspective. The thing is, with cyberspace trapping, we're taking advantage of a different circumstance, right? This isn't traditional cybersecurity. With cyberspace trapping, we're focused on what the attacker's tactics are themselves. These tactics change over time, and so our traps will need to evolve along with their TTP, but it gives us the opportunity to evolve alongside the attacker. It also allows us to breed uncertainty into their environment. If I'm an attacker and every time I use Mimikatz, I get kicked out of the environment within 24 hours, the next time I get in and I use Mimikatz and I get a domain admin password in plain text, do I dare to use it? Maybe I do, but I'm going to think really hard about it. And so when the attacker themselves is uncertain, they're vulnerable. When we deceive the attacker, they're weak. This provides us an opportunity. Cyberspace trapping is all about sowing this doubt, uncertainty, and confusion into the attacker's decision-making cycle, their OODA loop, which provides us the opportunity to defend our environments and win. That's all I have as far as the presentation goes. I'd like to open it up for questions and talk to y'all. What do you think?
Awesome talk as always. I actually got the chance to see that in person last year, and it was a really good refresher to see it again. We do have a few questions. Our first one comes from a name which I'm probably going to butcher. Amundeep Tahim asks, would having MFA on Windows servers and workstations mitigate LSASS poisoning attacks, since credentials will be stolen, but the MFA token won't be?
So MFA is really interesting. Now, there's two ways to look at this first, and I do want to bring up both positions because they affect us so heavily. We talk about multi-factor authentication, so MFA. We have to realize when MFA is there and when it is pretending to be there, let's say. For example, let's take a look at Windows environments. Can you do MFA in Windows? Allegedly, yes. For example, I got a Windows box over there, and it has Windows Hello, which is allegedly multi-factor. But if we actually look at the Windows authentication ecosystem, you've got 3 ways of connecting from one system to another. It's 4 ways, technically. Well, there's plenty of ways, but there's 4 main ones. Landman challenge response, which is pretty legacy, so let's not talk about that one. NTLM v1 and NTLM v2, which uses your NT credential to do a challenge response exchange in order to deliver a secure authentication channel. And then Kerberos. In enterprise environments, it ought to be Kerberos. Kerberos is really, well, I hesitate to call it really good, but it's a lot more computationally intense and strong, if you will, than the other 3 precursor protocols. But the thing is, with Kerberos, where's the MFA? Kerberos is based entirely on your NT hash and on the hash of both the Kerb TGT user account in Active Directory and the hash of the service that you're trying to actually access. These 3 hashes are all NT hashes. 2FA does not go into NT, period. So we have things like pass the ticket attacks. And so the first thing we want to think about with 2FA is it 2FA or is it pretending to be 2FA? So in Windows, when we have 2FA, it's actually translating that second factor into the first factor. So it's actually still one factor. Now it's a strong factor, don't get me wrong. Like if you have a common access card for like a PIN card, if you've got Windows Hello, the Windows NT hash that's created is really good. It's like having a really strong password, but it's still one factor. So that's the first thing that you actually have to acknowledge when we talk about MFA. Now let's say that MFA does exist and is implemented properly. Can we still trap against that? Absolutely. In fact, if you wanted to, if you really were trying to be a little bit, I don't want to say malicious because this is our environment, right? But if you really wanted to be sneaky, let's say, what about a system that does not support MFA but is really important? Like a human-machine interface for a supervisory access and control system or industrial control system, right? A lot of these systems, almost all of these systems actually have some kind of web interface that's used to turn the PLCs on and off. We don't want attackers to get to these interfaces because we might have things like the compromise that occurred in the Ukraine where the entire power grid was assaulted. Black Energy, I think is what it was called. That's really, really bad, really, really dangerous. And these systems, they generally do not support any kind of 2FA. But does the attacker know this? we could implement something of the sort too. So when we talk about 2FA, 2FA is really good. Don't get me wrong. If 2FA is an option and it really is 2FA, use it. Absolutely use it. It's really, really secure. It's really, really outstanding. It changes the game. It's a game changer. Unlike, let's say, injecting disinfectants. So you want to use 2FA if you absolutely can. If you can't, it does present the opportunity to generate and create those kind of traps. I hope that answered the question. If not, follow up. I'm really happy to keep diving into it.
Cool. I'll give them a chance to follow up, but in the meantime, Corey Ferris asks, with your DLP trap, that will only trigger after data is stolen. How can you prevent data loss in the first place?
Yeah, so that's a really important consideration there. Does it only trigger after data is stolen? Yes, and in fact, it not only doesn't trigger until data is stolen, it doesn't trigger until data is stolen and that Word document is open. These are all important things to identify. The thing is, what data is stolen? And that's what's really important. So what you want to do with a lot of these traps is you actually want to present the trap before the real data. So let's say that I have, in fact, pretty good example here. Let's say I'm Ashley Madison, because, you know, life is too short. Have an affair. And so as somebody who is involved with Ashley Madison, if I'm a competitor, if I'm a hacker, I want to get in and I want to get dirt on who's actually got an account here because we want to shame and blame all these folks. Okay, so that means that your list of customers is probably something really valuable. What if you create a fake one, completely fake, not real information, and you put it all over the place? When that's stolen, you don't know that the information has been stolen until it's been stolen. That's true, but it's also not real information. And so if we're talking about the DLP trap specifically as it relates to making it such that you can find out about it before the information itself is stolen, you can create it in that fashion. Now, there's of course a lot of other defenses you can do to prevent information being stolen. I mean, I have to harp on traditional defense here. Principle of least privilege, really important. Users who don't have a need to know or need to access information shouldn't have that access. Like, I'm not saying cyberspace trapping displaces controls. We want to have good security controls. But if we're using cyberspace trapping to observe and detect ahead of, say, information theft, what we want to do is we want to put those pieces of information at outlying points so that the attacker identifies and comes in contact with them before they come in contact with the real information. So the trap triggers before the reality of exposure is actualized.
Awesome. Our next question comes from Ravi Hans. How can MSSPs leverage traps?
Can you say it again? MSS what?
Managed security service providers.
Yeah, the last word though, pays?
Traps, sorry.
Oh, never mind. Sorry. I just heard incorrectly. Yeah. So Ps. That was the word. I'm sorry. I just heard that wrong. Yeah. So managed security service providers. They're actually a pretty significant vector for a lot of compromises for organizations. And I don't say that to be mean. I don't say it because it needs to be the case. I say that as somebody who's done a lot of pen tests lately and who's done a lot of incident response lately. And a lot of the findings I found to be the most severe, or the vector by which an organization actually got compromised, ended up being the MSSP itself. So what that actually means is that that's a really good question, because you're asking that question, and most managed security service providers really are not. They're not thinking about the security of their customers as they're providing these services, not thinking about the attacker or the threat model themselves either. So that you are is really heartening, and that's fantastic. As an MSP, can you put traps in place on environments? Yes, absolutely. In fact, from the perspective of monitoring these traps, and once they get triggered, you're probably in the best place because you have a lot of different environments and you can probably reuse some of those traps. But there is a downside. And that downside is that one of the biggest advantages of cyberspace trapping is that you can customize it based on the environment itself. If you're not the stakeholder or the custodian of the environment, though, it's a lot harder and takes a lot more effort to construct these traps, because you really have to understand the business of these attackers, the business of these organizations, because the business of those organizations is going to drive the reason behind why their attacker actually attacked them, the threat model, if you will. So as an MSP, can you do it? Yes, absolutely. It's going to require a little bit more hands-on and direct involvement with the client network, though, than it would for the actual client to do it themselves, which is just the nature of the beast. Should you, though? I think that the answer for most, and I hate to say this, I think the answer for the most MSSPs is they should probably not be doing cyberspace trapping for 2 reasons. One, you want to think about legality for some of these things first. It's not that they're illegal, but there's terms of use and conditions, and it's a bit more of a gray area. Now, once you've had the conversation with a customer, it's fine and everything's kosher. But it's like with penetration testing. Penetration testing, you can't really test until you have the permission to test memo. I would not go around trapping environments unless I had a permission to do so. And that permission can be something as simple as a slip that says, hey, do you allow us to do active trapping and defense circumstances in your environment? Sign here. And if that's signed, done. That's it. So the legal portion, I think, is easy to accomplish, but you should probably do that. The other side of it, though, is I see a lot of MSPs orchestrating environments in such a fashion with really, really bad security. I think that cyberspace trapping is very powerful, particularly for organizations who are relatively secure, but that a lot of that opportunity starts to drop off as the organization is less mature. For example, is there a point in doing, say, Mimikatz trapping if every user in your environment is a domain admin? Well, that sounds kind of ridiculous, right? What environment has that? What if every user is an administrator in a local system, and the local administrator for that system is the same local admin account as all the other systems? This happens all the time. And I've seen MSPs do it all the time too. If your environment is at this circumstance or at this point as far as security goes, you really need to start to lock down those things so that the time from compromise to actions on objectives is long enough for traps really to become valuable. And unfortunately, a lot of MSPs that I've encountered over the past couple of years are really just not doing a good job there. Now, if yours is, trapping all the way, man. Good luck.
Awesome. So I'm asking this just out of respect for your time, because I lost track of time a little bit because of how captivating you are. We're 7 minutes over. Is it okay for me to ask the last few questions, or do you have anywhere you need to be?
I've got all day, but I might have to crack this sucker open.
Oh,
yes, it's full. My full, and it's not, it's empty. Yeah, go for it. Absolutely.
Awesome. So kind of a follow-up then, since you sort of touched on this, Chino53 asks, are there any legal issues to consider with traps?
Yes and no. So when we talk about legal, actually, full disclosure, first off, I am not a lawyer and I cannot provide legal advice. That being said, when we talk about legal issues in cybersecurity, there's a couple things that we need to consider. But these considerations are also very different depending on our perspective. If we own the environment, so we're first party, or if we are, let's say, a third-party penetration tester who comes in as a consultant in order to test the environment, those two circumstances make for really, really different things. For example, if I'm a third-party tester, I need to have permission to do basically anything. To be fair, standard internet stuff, you technically don't need permission for, but I wouldn't play with that because things can go really, really badly. For example, sometimes I do expert witness work. So I was doing expert witness, which is essentially legal work, where as the expert I say, here's my perspective on the circumstance. And it was for an organization who had backups, 2 server backups, right, that were both the servers were separate from the individual system, and both servers were balancing and backing up versus each other every single day. And both servers physically, and I don't mean like they broke, I mean like physically they melted the systems. They actually melted down, they broke badly at the exact same time. What's the opportunity, what's the chance of that happening? Really, really low. And so my perspective on it was that's not normal. The most likely circumstance that I can consider based on all the situations is that maybe they were ransomware, and then that the disk operations, right, against the inodes, let's say, that were happening because the ransomware attack maybe caused the spinning disk to actually physically break, maybe. But what happened actually is, well, not what happened, but the circumstance around that was that they had a third party who was doing the administration of their network, like an MSP, if you will. And she was there just for IT support purposes. She forgot the password, or the organization, she owned the organization. She forgot the password to their environment, and they forgot the password too, and so they had to have the password reset. And so what she said in email is, don't worry about it. I have elite hacker skills and tools that I stole from the dark web, or took from the dark web, learned from the dark web, that I'm going to use to unlock the password. Now, what she actually used was a tool called Pogo Stick, which we actually have in SANS courses like 506, 560. It's a pretty standard tool, but she got it from who knows what forum, and it might have been Trojan and backdoored. And my opinion, this is actually not part of the expert witness portion, my opinion on the side was that she probably brought somebody else into the environment who then compromised it and failed to successfully ransomware properly. But when we talk about legality here, as the third party, did she have permission to do that? Was she hired for these purposes? And the answer is no. I mean, if she had gotten permission specifically, hey, can I use this tool that I got from who knows where? I mean, to be fair, talking about permission, the more vague you leave it, the better off you are, because it's the responsibility whoever approves to understand what they're approving. And if you just leave it really kind of vague, then you have permission for all of us. So like, hey, can I do whatever it takes in order to unlock the system? And if the customer agrees to whatever it takes, well, whatever it takes might not be the best be the best idea, but it's still whatever it takes. So liability there starts to get detracted based on that. And I think this is really kind of important. So if we're talking about traps and liability, we want to think about the risk and what kind of potential damages could be done. Now, as far as traps go, because they're based specifically on the attack itself and countermeasures against that attack, it's actually really, really rare for well-orchestrated traps to have any even mild risk of significant damage, which is actually different than honeypots. This is one of the reasons why trapping is a lot easier to get approval for than honeypots. Because with a honeypot, a honeypot always starts off as a good idea, right? Somebody gets a honeypot, they set it up, it's a standard system, but since it's a standard system, but not a real one, it has to be administrated, it has to be patched at a different rate and separate process than everything else, which means eventually maybe the person moves on or goes to a position or leaves the company, and the honeypot gets forgotten, and now it's this sinking like cesspool of vulnerability inside the organization and environment itself. With a trap, since it's based specifically around the attacker and his TTP, you have a lot less risk, which also as a result leads to less liability. Now that said, I would not recommend implementing traps, and this isn't because it's illegal or because you have direct liability, it's just because it's good practice, right? I wouldn't recommend implementing traps without the direct approval of the system owner and the organization itself to do those kind of things. And for the organization, that might be something like, hey, we have approval to do traps in general, and the system owner has more specific, let's say tactical level approval, hey, this is the trap we want to do, can we do it, yes or no? Because let's say that it's a database or something, you're putting some kind of trap as a fake credit card number or something in a database. If you put that in the database in a fashion that leaves, let's say it's a SQL relational database that leaves some of the relationships to other tables undone, that could potentially cause the application itself to crash because we just don't understand the application as well as the system owner does. And so maybe those relationships need to also be inserted into those database tables in order to make it work. My point is, I've seen systems crash because of a 1 kilobyte text file. And whenever something breaks, there's some degree of liability. As a cybersecurity practitioner, I feel like it's my job and also my save my own skin, if you will, kind of a point in that is to make sure that we've offloaded as much liability as we can. And it's not because we're passing the buck, but we just don't have as much expertise as maybe the owner of the system themselves does. And so if we pass that responsibility onto them, they're not only going to take on the liability for us, but they also have a better ability to accept the liability that we're potentially putting in front of them. Now, all those things said, that's kind of cybersecurity and legality in general. For cyberspace trapping, there's a lot less that can go wrong, which means there's just a lot less burden there.
Awesome. So I'm going to limit it to just 2 more questions, as long as you're okay with that.
Yep, absolutely.
So this next one also comes from Chino53. Have you got any examples of how you might use this to prevent Kerberoasting?
That's an interesting one. Let's see here. Do I have examples that I can put in slides? I don't have those examples, but I can posit one for you here. So let's talk Kerberoasting here really, really briefly first. I'm not Tim Medine, so I didn't invent it, but I am quite familiar with it. So the idea with Kerberoasting here is you're attacking one of the 3 general vulnerability points of the authentication model for Kerberos itself. Golden tickets, silver tickets, and Kerberoasting attack all three. With golden ticket, essentially, you're taking advantage of the fact that the Kerberos hash itself is what's used to create the ticket granting ticket. With a silver ticket, you're taking advantage of the fact that with the service ticket, the hash of the service itself is what's being used. With Kerberoasting, what you're taking advantage of is the service account themselves. So with service accounts, any domain user, you do have to be a domain user, but any domain user, so you fish in and you're a domain user, any domain user can request a service ticket. And the reason they can do this is because they have a ticket granting ticket. They're a real domain user. Now that ticket granting ticket might provide no actual access or permissions against that service, but they can request a service ticket. Then the service itself, when presented with that ticket, will say, nope, you don't have permission, but they can still request a service ticket. Since the service ticket is encrypted with a hash of the service itself, it means that you can do essentially online cracking attacks against this hash for any service in Active Directory that's managed by Kerberos. That's cool, but what does it mean? Since the service ticket is created by the hash, and the hash is based on the password, it means that it's a password cracking attack. That's all it is. Like Kerberoasting, essentially you can grab all the tickets and you can do password cracking offline against them. Now there is some importance to that. Like say it's online password guessing, we're probably talking about 1,000 to 5,000 guesses per second. If we're talking about NT password cracking offline with GPU-based systems, let's say just 4 GPUs that are 10As, but I guess we're being old these days, we're still talking 6 billion per second. There's a huge difference between those. With Kerberos, we actually have a little bit of advantage. The computational intensity of a Kerberos ticket is significantly higher than that of an NT hash, so your cracking is a lot slower. I'd say like 1,000th the speed. Now, to be fair, 1,000th of 6 billion is still a lot. So if your password is password 123 for the service, yeah, really big deal. But if we're talking about the service itself and its password, if the password is really strong, and by really strong I mean like let's say it's 12 characters long, 12, 14 characters long, you're probably not going to crack it successfully. Now, if we wanted to trap against this, we could create any service and create a weak password for it. And if that's used, it's exactly like our password tool, because we can look for account lockout and those kind of things exactly the same way.
All right.
Like in this case, anticipate any access.
Awesome. Yeah. For our last question then, from Superfish, where would you say the best place to put fake credentials into LSASS would be? Specific servers, domain controllers, workstations of admins, etc.?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I got to comment on the name first though, Superfish. I wrote once upon a time, and this is actually my first presentation at DerpCon, a tool called Subterfuge. And it's a man-in-the-middle tool, and so there's this other thing called Superfish that essentially put a fake certificate authority, or a secondary certificate authority into the registry of Lenovo systems, which is installed by default. Really bad, really dangerous. And I put that into Subterfuge, so great name, and I love the reference. As far as LSASS, there's two ways to look at this. And that has to do with, I don't want to say incident of false positives, because it's not going to be false positives either way, but it has to do with the administrative burden and how important you want the signature trigger to actually be. For example, I would generally recommend putting this at the edges of the environment. The first place that attackers are going to start to use Mimikatz is the places where they first get access to the environment, right? Somebody clicks a link, the attacker tries to escalate privileges, and then they run Mimikatz immediately. And if they don't get anything, they try to move laterally, and then they do that same process again and again and again. This starts on workstations. Now, of course, the attacker wants to migrate to servers because they're likely to get more value from Mimikatz in these servers, but it probably started with a workstation. So in general, I like to recommend starting the exact same way with your traps. Now, that said, do you have more workstations or do you have more servers? You have more workstations, which means you have to probably put this PowerShell startup script if you're using the, say, fuzzy security-based script for putting credentials into LSASS in order to build these traps. It means that you're probably gonna have to put those together or push them out, say using something like SCCM to push things out, or if you have some other kind of system to administer the systems individually in order to push that actually out to those systems. it just means you get more administrative burden if you're dealing with workstations as opposed to servers. If that burden is more time involved and invested than value that you extract, then I would recommend focusing on the servers themselves. Do realize that if you pull the traps in to your environment, you're getting closer to the high risk circumstances too. So while they might, excuse me, trigger the trap on, say, a server, they might also get real creds too, which might be okay. That might be within your risk tolerance, but I think you have to think those things through before you decide how to administer or how to orchestrate. If you have the time and cycles, I tend to recommend workstations.